Bit of Kerbal Space Program cinematic playthrough. We've just watched the pod lander make another routine mission to the surface of the moon, and it's now headed back to Beluga so we can analyze all the surface samples. Now, I mentioned last time I didn't actually have many biomes available to me in an equatorial orbit, so what I did for this landing is incline my orbit before landing to see if I could find any better biomes. And I did. I landed in the canyons biome this time and got some brand new science I'd never collected before. I had to be a little bit careful about how inclined my orbit was. Obviously, if I overcook the inclination, then I won't have enough fuel to get back to the Beluga, and, well, that would cause all sorts of problems. Not that that'd be really too hard to deal with. I mean, the Beluga's got quite a lot of fuel on it, so we could actually go and get the lander if we really had to. Now, here what you can see me doing is raising my orbit up to that of the Beluga, but not so that I get an encounter, but so that the apoapse is on top of one of the ascending or descending nodes. This way, when I perform my inclination change to match that of the Beluga, I can make it as efficient as possible. Plane change maneuvers are incredibly expensive, and they're even more expensive when you do them in a lower orbit. So it's far better to perform a plane change when you're in a higher orbit. The reason for this is because when you're in a higher orbit, you're actually traveling slower. So any changes you make to your velocity will actually have a bigger impact in your overall direction. Now, ideally, you would have your ascending or descending node overlapping your target intercept, and that way when you cancel out the relative velocities, you will also be including your plane change maneuver in that. It is always the most efficient way to do things if you can combine all of your maneuvers into one single burn. And that's what I did here. I incorporated my rendezvous maneuver into my plane change maneuver, that way I could spend as little fuel as possible. And here we are, the pod is pulling up to the Beluga. Despite it being such a routine mission, it is always wonderful to see such synchronized free-falling. Yes, the only thing more beautiful than the ballet of orbital mechanics is our mastery over it. Now, as I mentioned, we only really can perform so much of an inclination change to get to new biomes, which does pose a bit of a limitation on where we can actually go. Which means eventually we're going to run out of biomes, and it's actually going to happen pretty soon, so we need to come up with more of a long-term plan to harvest science here. So what I'm either going to do is design a new lander to dock with the Beluga and then perform lunar missions, one that has a lot more range. Or I was thinking maybe we could take the Beluga to Minmus with the pod lander and then just basically do the same thing, keep landing on the surface, harvesting the science and coming back. Honestly, that was the job of Flower before I spontaneously decided to send them on solar orbit and potentially expose them to lethal amounts of solar radiation. Now on to the main topic of today's video. The keen-eyed among you would have noticed a transfer window coming up to Juna. Now, originally I was just going to send maybe a surface probe to land on Juna, maybe one to go to Ike as well, but I started having larger ambitions. So instead I'm going to be sending an entirely crewed mission to Juna that will land on the surface of Juna and on Ike, and hopefully bring them all back in one piece. So what I'm launching here is the main drive module, and let me tell you, this was a difficult thing to put in orbit because it is huge and it is heavy. It has a whopping 80,000 units of fuel, both in liquid fuel and oxidizer. On top of that, it has 5 of the skiff engines, which are really good for interplanetary travel. And yeah, whenever I make one of these large habitation missions, I always send up the fuel tank first because it is the heaviest part of the vessel and therefore will be an absolute pain to maneuver in space using RCS. So rather than sending up a big heavy fuel tank and trying to dock it with the main station, I do it the other way around. I dock the main station to the heavy fuel tanks. The final ship, which I will be naming Valkyrie, will also have an additional fuel tank. I just wanted to be super safe with the range of this vessel. Going to Juna really only requires around 4,000 kilometers per second of delta V. I think this thing has just under 5, but I thought I just want a bit of wiggle room. If I want to travel to Ike and back with the main station, I can, and maybe refuel any landers if I have to. But there we are, there's the final tank in orbit. Unfortunately, I did have to use some of the fuel in this stage to circularize the orbit, so we will have to refuel this thing before it sets off. And we go straight on to the next launch. This is the extra fuel tank that I was talking about. This was definitely one of the easier launches of making this ship, as you'll see later on. There was one stage in particular that gave me quite a bit of hassle. But yeah, so Juna is obviously Kerbal's analog to Mars. And I had a whole module last year on the solar system, and we had a pretty interesting lecture on Mars. Well, I mean, the lecture itself wasn't actually on Mars, it was just about Mars. It would have been very cool if it was on Mars. One of the interesting things that I learned was that Mars is actually in the Goldilocks zone around our sun. I always thought it was cold because it was far away from the sun, like too far to get any usable heat, but that's actually not true. The reason it's so cold is because it's so small. And you know, size can impact the temperature of a planet in a few ways. Obviously, if a planet is much bigger, then the temperatures at its core are a lot hotter, and that heat will radiate through the mantle and the crust. But not only that, if a planet is bigger, then it has a higher gravity, which means it can hold on to its atmosphere better, and an atmosphere is a very good way of capturing and storing heat. But because Mars is so small, it doesn't have much of an atmosphere at all, and it's not generating huge amounts of heat in its core like Earth would be. And in fact, Mars's core only generates around 30% of the heat that Earth's core generates. And you know, having a small, not so hot core can actually be pretty devastating for a planet, because that would be the main protection against solar radiation. Obviously, the Earth has a magnetic field that is produced by the liquid core moving around so much, and that protects us from all of the harsh radiation that the sun sends our way. But sadly, Mars doesn't really have much of a magnetic field anymore, so its atmosphere has been stripped away very slowly over billions of years by solar radiation. All that being said, that doesn't necessarily mean Mars is completely inhospitable. You know, we've seen over the last few decades plenty of evidence for water on Mars. And actually, if you look at the topology of the planet, it looks like the whole northern hemisphere used to be one giant ocean. And you know, more interestingly, they've actually found underground aquifers and, you know, a whole groundwater system on Mars. And there's a few ways they did this. I think the InSight lander used some kind of magnetic experiment. I'm not fully clued up on all the details, but the magnetic evidence was consistent of underground water. And Orbital probes, I could not tell you which, using, I think, high-energy neutrino scattering to detect underground water. I am not fully sure how this worked. It was one of those lectures where there was a lot of information very fast, and I could barely write anything down, so I'm not fully sure about that. And yeah, all of this water on Mars gets astrobiologists pretty excited at the prospect of life on Mars having existed, or even continuing to exist. In the northern hemisphere every summer there's a very noticeable release of methane. Now, you know, here on Earth methane comes from life. And Mars has been geologically dead for about 2 billion years or thereabouts. So it's very unlikely that there's any active geological processes producing this methane. It could potentially be left over from previous volcanic activity, but again, we wouldn't know what process causes it to be released, you know, periodically every summer. Anyway, enough rambling about Mars. Here I am using the fuel from the transfer stage of this extra fuel tank module to try and fill back up the tanks in the main drive stage. And then I just deorbit this transfer stage because Kessler syndrome is no joke. Now, this launch was fraught with disaster. What you're watching now is actually my 5th attempt at launching this rocket. You can see the payload there is incredibly unaerodynamic, and I didn't have any fairings big enough to actually put it in, so I basically spammed a bunch of tail fins at the bottom of the rocket there just to keep it stable. I've nicknamed this module the Shell. It's basically a housing unit for the life support. Hopefully we'll get a better look at it once it's in orbit. This was designed with reusability in mind, so that the life support module could simply be swapped out without having to take apart the whole craft to do so. This module contains a few other things as well. It contains a probe core, some solar panels and communication dishes, as well as some habitation area and a gravity ring. The gravity ring hopefully making it a little easier for my kerbals to stay in space for a long time. The solar panels and communication dishes are hooked onto the arm sticking out the bottom, and that will extend with a hinge once in orbit. But yeah, just circularizing my orbit here, and I breathe a sigh of relief as the hard part is now over and I can just perform the orbital rendezvous as usual. Or so I thought. A key detail that I had forgotten to include was any kind of SAS module whatsoever. This meant the only way I could control my attitude was through the RCS system, and then there was no way to make sure I maintained any particular heading, so this was horrid to move in orbit. As you'll see in a minute, it moves with all the grace of a reversing dump truck on ice. And this made it pretty much impossible to do the maneuver. I mean, it wasn't impossible, but it was trying my patience quite badly. So after about 10 minutes of furiously wrestling with this craft, trying to get the encounter as close as possible, I decided to try a different approach. I undocked the extra fuel tank from Valkyrie and used that to go and get the shell. This has a single SAS module on it, which it's not great, but is much better than no SAS modules at all, so I figured it would make the docking process a little easier. I've had to cut this down loads because the whole mission probably took me around 40 to 50 minutes to do. And even at 4 times speed, it would just make the video far too long. The reason it took so long is because obviously I had it all pretty much rendezvoused, and then when I went to go get the shell with the extra fuel tank, it slowly drifts apart from the Valkyrie, and then I have to basically perform a whole new rendezvous again. But after tearing out my hair and crying a lot, I finally get the fuel tank docked to the shell. And it was finally time to bring it back to the Valkyrie, hopefully with a bit more ease this time. Again, skipping through all of the boring corrections that you have to make when on approach. And there were a lot of them, because the only way this thing can move around is with the RCS system, so it can't actually pick up a whole lot of speed, which means it tends to drift off course very easily. The best way to stop yourself drifting away from your target as you're on approach is by simply just going towards it faster, but I couldn't do that here, so there were loads of corrections. And there we finally are, an eternity later, and we actually get the shell docked to the Valkyrie. And yeah, I didn't even stop to take a cinematic shot because I was just so fed up by this point. And with that, we move on to the last structural module of the Valkyrie. So this module is the command module. It contains some of the habitation for the crew, as well as a scientific laboratory packed with all of my newest experiments. It was honestly a blessing to fly something that could actually hold its attitude and was easy to fly. The rendezvous went pretty much without a hitch. It was fairly standard, so we'll just skip through it pretty quick. And there we are, that is the main vessel of the Valkyrie complete. There I am just trying to inflate the gravity ring, which took an unreasonable amount of time. And in doing so took up all the nitrogen on the ship and didn't even fill up all the way, so we will have to refill all the nitrogen. That'll be done in the next mission where I send up the life support module. And there's me trying to extend the solar panel arms. For some reason they weren't doing it, and I could not figure out why until I realized there is, I don't know if you can see it, a stray strut that I didn't actually put there. I'm not sure how it's ended up attached that way. I might have just misclicked or something, but it was preventing the whole thing from moving. I thought it had something to do with auto strut. I just had no idea. After faffing around with it too much, you see I overextend it, and luckily it just clipped through the ship rather than make anything explode, because that probably would have made me cry. And I thought it was pretty funny the way that these arms were flapping around like penguin flippers. Eventually I lock the mechanism and they remain rigid, and then I extend the solar panels. As I mentioned before, the arms are actually also on a servo motor, so I can rotate them. I wasn't really sure whether I would be able to get sunlight from all angles, and obviously with the other stations, Beluga and Flower, having problems with their electricity, I didn't want to take any chances and make sure I could always face the solar panels to the sun. And there it is, the Valkyrie, our interplanetary mission to Juna. We still have to add the life support module, as well as refill all the nitrogen and put crew in here, but unfortunately I'll have to do that all in the next episode. If you're new to the series, you can catch up with the older episodes using the playlist that this is in, and if you enjoyed this episode, maybe consider subscribing to the channel. But yeah, thank you very much for watching this episode of Cinematic Playthrough, and I hope to catch you next time.